Good day. For this presentation, I would be presenting my theoretical paper on the welfare implications of the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. To begin, we must discuss what is coronavirus and what is the Philippine government doing for this situation. So, according to the World Health Organization, coronavirus disease, or COVID 19, is an infectious disease that impairs the respiratory function of the infected. Basically, this was caused by a newly discovered coronavirus and was first detected in China. And unfortunately, this pandemic has been seeing a rapid increase in numbers all over the world. And because this is considered a global pandemic, the Philippines is not exempted from this disease. To be exact, the Philippine government enacted the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act. And among the many provisions of this act, this paper would focus on analyzing two, namely community quarantine, which ranges from enhanced community quarantine, the most restrictive, to modified general community quarantine, the least restrictive. So these community protocols are aimed to restrict operations of certain industries into categories of allowed, partially allowed with 50%, with 30% operational capacity, skeletal workforce only, and not allowed. In addition, this paper would also be analyzing the social amelioration programs provided. These are the emergency subsidy provided by the government, and at the minimum, the cash grants would be 5,000, and at the maximum, it would be 8,000. Those targeted would be low-income households and those mostly affected by the declaration of the ECQ. So to name a few, these are employees affected by the no work, no pay policy, drivers of jeepneys, tricycles, and the likes, and vulnerable sectors like senior citizens, PWD, and much more. That said, holistically, this paper aims to theoretically examine the effects of the said policies on welfare of the economic agents. So the economic model to be used here are one of an agent that maximizes his or her utility by choosing consumption and leisure subject to a time endowment and budget constraints. Here, the SAP or the Social Amelioration Program and the community quarantine would also be presented, as well as a comparative statics would also be analyzed. So, to support this paper, I've reviewed publications with similar objectives and goals. For one, we have the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or most commonly known as the 4Ps. Here, this program grants conditional cash transfers to beneficiary households subject to compliance with program conditionalities. Those targeted here would be chronic poor households with children ages 0 to 14 years old, and the cash grants ranges from 500 pesos to 1,400 pesos per household per month. According to studies that reviews its welfare and distributional impacts, it has been known to cause a decrease in poverty incidence by 2.6% and income gap by 5.3%. According to the study, this paved way for improved education and health for the children. On the other hand, in another study that studies its effectiveness on social welfare and development, it was seen to have caused an increase in annual per capita income. This means that, according to the study, it was effective in developing human capital, basically or specifically in the form of parent empowerment and, again, as mentioned, improved health and standard of education for the children. So another similar publications would be conditional cash transfers in Latin America. Because poverty and vulnerability are enduring problems in these areas, their government felt that by imposing these kinds of problems, it would help in reducing poverty. So again, these are programs that combines monetary benefits with incentives for curbing child labor and fostering the accumulation of human capital. For example, in Mexico, we have Progresa, now called Oportunidades, which seeks to prioritize groups at high risk of dropping out of school and of maternal and infant mortality. Specifically, those targeted here are households that have children ages 8 to 18 years old enrolled in school, infants from 4 to 24 months, undernourished children, and pregnant women. Those who have met these conditionalities are entitled to cash benefits to about 20% of their annual expenditures. And a study entitled Welfare Programs and Labor Supply in Developing Countries concluded that this has caused household consumption to increase, wages and labor to increase as well, and finally, employment of beneficiaries. With all these results, it therefore validates the positive impacts of this program on the social development of the impoverished. Another example we have is Brazil's Bolsa Familia. This is a CCT program launched to guarantee a minimum income to the extreme poor and to promote national standards and procedures within selective measures. Compared to the program in Mexico, households here are targeted based on their income, which is then compared to the eligibility threshold set nationally. Then, cash grants are given to them, which is equivalent to about 10% of their income. In an article that studies its impact on children's health, it has been known to cause improved healthcare services, has positive impacts on food purchase and diet quality, and higher expenses on food and caloric availability. According to the article, this therefore indeed improves the autonomy of its beneficiaries and empower the most vulnerable people in Brazil. Moving on, we now have the economic model. As mentioned, the theoretical model presented here would be of an economic agent maximizing his or her utility by choosing consumption and leisure subject to a time endowment and budget constraints. So suppose that the agent's utility function is given by U equal to G as a function of C plus M as a function of L. Here we assume that the agent derives utility from both consumption and leisure. Therefore, GC here would be the utility out of consumption, and ML here would be the utility out of leisure. Here we also assume that the following first-order derivatives hold. For 1, we have the partial derivative of u with respect to c, which is denoted as g sub c, and the partial derivative of u with respect to L, we have m sub L. Both are greater than 0 because this guarantees that utility is increasing as consumption and leisure increases. Next is we have the second partial derivative of u with respect to c, denoted as g sub cc, and the second partial derivative of u with respect to L, denoted as m sub LL. Here, both are less than 0, so that marginal utility is diminishing and that the utility function is concave. Lastly, we have the cross-partial derivative of u with respect to c at L, which is equal to 0. This guarantees that the utility is separable in consumption and leisure, and it is also set for simplicity purposes. As mentioned, we also have the agent's time endowment constraint. This is given by big H equal to small h plus L, where H is the total time available, which is also greater than 0, small h is the working time, and L is the leisure time. Since we will also be analyzing the Bayanihan 3+1 Act, the budget constraint of the economic agent is modified as follows. It is also important to note that the economic agent here is assumed to be on a no work, no pay policy. Therefore, his budget constraint would be W wage times 1 minus Q quarantine plus working time H plus the social amelioration program A is equal to consumption. Quarantine is added here because it is expected to restrict the hours worked, therefore limiting hourly wages. While social amelioration program A is added here because it is expected to increase the spending of the agent, therefore increasing his consumption. Here we assume that wage W is greater than 0 and A is greater than or equal to 0. A here is the social amelioration program. We also assume that quarantine ranges from 0 to 1, which is important to note because this plays a crucial role in the analysis. Because let's say that when Q is equal to 0, it means that no community quarantine is imposed, and that when Q is equal to 1, means that an enhanced community quarantine is imposed, which is the most strictest. So let's say that an enhanced community quarantine is imposed. Going back to the previous slide, this now would become 1. Therefore, W now would be multiplied by 0 times H plus A is equal to C. W times 0 times H would be 0. Therefore, we would be left with A is equal to C. A is equal to C means that there would be no wage at all for the economic agent, and now his consumption would be slowly dependent on the SAP distributed. This situation is unfortunate for those who are not on the receiving end of this subsidy. Well, that said, from all these inputs, we can now derive the agent's constraint problem and objective function. Now we must maximize G as a function of C plus M as a function of L, which is the utility out of consumption and utility out of leisure, subject to W 1 minus Q times the time endowment constraint computed from here, plus the social amelioration program A equal to consumption. Setting up the Lagrangian function, we would now have G as a function of C plus M as a function of L plus lambda times W times 1 minus Q times H minus L plus A minus consumption C. From the Lagrangian function, we can now derive the first order conditions. We now have the first order conditions, or the partial derivative with respect to C, equal to G sub C minus lambda, the partial derivative with respect to leisure equal to M sub L minus lambda times W 1 minus Q equal to 0, and the partial derivative with respect to lambda, which is W 1 minus Q times H minus L plus A minus C equal to 0. Since these are general functions, we can already derive from the first order conditions the optimal amounts of consumption and leisure, which are C star equal to C as a function of wage, quarantine, time, and amelioration program. L star is equal to L as a function of W, Q, H, and A. From that, simplifying equations 6 and 7 will now give us this equation. If we go back here, we can see that if we transfer lambda to this side, we would now have its value, which would be G sub C. And if we input G sub C into this equation, it would now be giving us, as mentioned, this equation. And by rearranging these, we would now have the marginal rate of substitution of consumption for leisure, which is given by M sub L, which is also important to note that is a function of optimal C and L, over G sub C, which is also a function of optimal C and L, equal to W 1 minus Q. This simply means that the more restrictive the community quarantine is, the lesser the wage the agent would receive. Therefore, he would now choose to spend more time at home or doing leisure over buying goods or consumption. With all that, we can now move on to the comparative statics analysis. So in this section, we would see how the economic agent would react on his leisure and consumption should the government policies on quarantine and the social amelioration program change. To begin, to measure the impact of community quarantine on leisure and consumption, we must first take the derivative of equations 8 and 9 with respect to Q. Going back, equations 8 and 9 would be, equation 9 is given by this, which is derived from these two first-order conditions, and equation 8 would be this, which is the budget constraint. Going back, it would be giving us these equations, which is M sub LL, which is the second partial derivative of M with respect to L, times the derivative of L with respect to Q, minus the second partial derivative of G with respect to C, times W times 1 minus Q, times the derivative of C minus with respect to Q, plus G sub C times W is equal to 0. On the other hand, for the budget constraint, its derivative would be negative W times 1 minus Q times the derivative of L with respect to Q minus the derivative of C with respect to Q plus W times L is equal to 0. Rearranging this by moving these two variables to the other side, we would have these equations, which would prove to be vital for the next following computations. So to solve for the derivatives of L and C with respect to Q, we can express equations 10 and 11 into a matrix. So going back, the unknowns here would be the derivative of L and the derivative of C with respect to Q. Therefore, their coefficients would be m sub LL and negative g sub cc w 1 minus q. Now we can input this to the first row, here. For the second row, we simply have to get its coefficient as well, which in this case would be w1 minus q and implicitly 1. Again, we can put this in the second row here. For this matrix, we simply have to put the vector of unknowns, which again is a derivative of t with respect to q, or the derivative of L with respect to q, and a derivative of c with respect to q. And simply put negative g sub c w and wl into this matrix. So to solve again for the derivatives of L and C with respect to Q, we must first compute for the determinant of this coefficient matrix. To do so, we can multiply this diagonal and this diagonal and then subtract it with each other. By doing so, we can have this equation here. By simplifying this, we have A equal to m sub LL plus w raised to 2 times 1 minus q raised to 2 times g sub cc. And given the concavity of the utility function and the diminishing marginal utility, this would now be negative or less than 0. With the determinant, we can now find the derivative of L and C with respect to Q by multiplying this matrices with each other and then by multiplying it with 1 over the determinant. That means we multiply 1 by this term, g sub ccw 1 minus q by this term, and we get this first row over in this matrix. Similarly, if we multiply this equation to this and this equation to this, we can get the second row. By multiplying the first row with 1 over the determinant A, we can now have the derivative of L with respect to Q. And by multiplying the second row with 1 over the determinant A, we can now have the derivative of C with respect to Q. Therefore, assuming that all assumptions stands, that being G sub C is greater than 0, wage is greater than 0, G sub CC and M sub LL is less than 0, the derivative of L now with respect to Q would be greater than 0 or positive, and the derivative of C now with respect to Q would be less than 0 or negative. Therefore, this means that a positive derivative of leisure with respect to Q means that an increase in the restriction of community quarantine will cause economic agents to spend more of their time doing leisure activities and less of their time working. This is because the community quarantine causes their wages to be limited anyway. While on the other hand, the derivative of consumption with respect to Q is negative because the quarantine parameters decreases their capacity to spend. Therefore, all in all, reduces their consumption as well. Now we'll look at the impact of the social amelioration program on consumption and leisure. Since these are general functions, it would be more efficient to be using the implicit function theorem. And to begin, we will differentiate equations 8 and 9 with respect to A. Equations 8 and 9 again are the budget constraints and those derived from the two first-order conditions. By getting their partial derivative, we would be having these two equations. And then, by rearranging both, it would give us these two. These two would be useful in doing the matrix and finding the derivatives of L and the derivatives of C with respect to A. Again, the coefficients would now be m sub LL and negative g sub cc w 1 minus q, and we can input that in the first row here, while for the second row, we can input these coefficients, 1, w 1 minus q, and implicitly 1. Then we can put these equations, 0 and 1, and equate it to the matrix here. To find again the derivatives of L and the derivatives of C with respect to A, we must now look for the determinant. And to do so, as mentioned previously, we only need to have to multiply m sub LL with 1 and negative g sub cc w1 minus q with w1 minus q and subtracted to each other. By subtracting to each other, we would have this equation. And by summarizing, and with all the assumptions holding, B now would be negative or less than 0. With all these inputs, we can now finally solve for the derivatives of L and C with respect to A. Again, we multiply 1 over the determinant to the adjoint. And recalling, getting the adjoint is by simply exchanging these two diagonals with each other and changing the signs of these two diagonals. This will now become positive, and this would now become negative. That gives us the adjoint over here. Now we simply have to multiply the matrices to find the answer. Again, we multiply the row by the column, and it will give us these answers. Implicitly, the derivative of L with respect to A now would be 1 over B times the first row. And the derivative of C now with respect to A would be 1 over B times the second row. And assuming that all assumptions hold, that being g sub cc is less than 0, w is greater than 1, and mll is less than 0, we would both have a positive answer. Therefore, the positive derivative of leisure with respect to A indicates that a change in the amount of SAP causes the economic agent to spend more of their time in leisure than working. And on the other hand, a positive derivative of consumption with respect to A implies that, like in leisure, as the amount of SAP increases, the more the agent would allocate income on consumption. So basically, this means that a change in SAP increases the capacity of people to spend for their needs without having to increase time spent working, but rather doing leisure activities. Holistically, the purpose of this paper is to see the quarantine and SAP impacts on the welfare of agents. And to do so, we must first differentiate the indirect utility with respect to Q, and later on with respect to SAP, A. So for that, we have this equation, that being the partial derivative of the V with respect to Q is equals to G sub C times the derivative of C with respect to Q plus M sub L times the derivative of L with respect to Q. Assuming that all assumptions hold, these results now become ambiguous. It means that the results will be conditional to which term is greater. Should, let's say, the term with consumption become greater, there would become a negative effect on welfare. On the other hand, should the term with the leisure become greater, there would be a positive effect on welfare, both of which are represented in this equation. On the other hand, as for the social amelioration program, we also have to differentiate the indirect utility with respect to SAP. And doing that will give us this. The results would be the partial derivative of v with respect to a would be g sub c times the derivative of c with respect to a plus m sub l times the derivative of l with respect to a. Should the assumptions g sub c greater than 0, m sub l greater than 0, derivative of c with respect to a greater than 0, and derivative of l greater than a with respect to a is greater than 0, this result would always be positive. Internally or holistically, this means that a change in the amount of SAP or an increase in the amount of SAP distributed increases the welfare of economic agents. This is because he would have increased his utility or satisfaction by doing so. With all these results at hand, we can now summarize or have a conclusion. So the results indicate that the stricter the quarantine protocols are, the lesser the wage received, resulting to economic agents choosing leisure over consumption as the protocols becomes more restricting. This is most likely due to the fact that the quarantine protocols restrict the operations or the hours of operations of workers. Moreover, with increased restrictions, individuals also tend to choose to spend more of their time in leisure than in work. While in terms of consumption, they tend to spend less of their income on goods and services. This is also most likely because that the quarantine protocols dampens the capacity of an individual to spend, therefore reduces his consumption all in all. This also goes hand in hand with the increase in the amount of SAP. Here, people would choose to spend more of their time at home than at work, since their income they believe would be compensated for anyway. On the other hand, in terms of consumption, an increase in the SAP also increases the capacity of a person to spend, therefore increases his consumption all in all. With this, we can conclude that although the effect of quarantine on welfare is ambiguous, these policy variables still generally have a positive effect on welfare because either way it increases the utility of the economic agent. And as support, similar articles with similar conditional cash transfer programs would agree that it does have a positive effect on individuals. With that, this ends my paper, and I hope this proves to be a great reference for policymakers as well as researchers interested to explore these kinds of topics. Thank you for listening.